Okay, so I've kept. It's all flared up again as a result of recent events in the United States. Of course, terrible events, both for members of the black community in the United States. Well, everybody in the United States, really. But then in terms of the police force as well. And I've kind of kept away from all of that, mainly because of this kind of ridiculous argument about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. And I really just cannot be asked to get involved in any of that, and these discussions about what's appropriate to say and what isn't appropriate to say. I suppose if I had to crystallise, just because otherwise I'm going to get the comments anyway, if I had to crystallise whether I think all lives matter is an appropriate response to Black Lives Matter, what I would say is if somebody is hashtagging or using Black Lives Matter as a slogan for something where it doesn't specifically appear to be a problem that just affects black people, then that's probably a legitimate response to make. But if it is something that seems to specifically be affecting black people, or is in the main affecting black people are getting a shitty end of the stick with regard to it, then maybe that's not the most appropriate thing to say. And so what I would say is apply those rules to each scenario. What I want to talk about is this 10-point plan, this Black Lives Matter 10-point plan, which actually, whichever side of this ridiculous Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter argument you're on, this is something that I would commend. It's actually not a new thing. It's called Campaign Zero, and I think they started it last year, but obviously it's got a new lease of life with the recent events that have taken place. Now, I looked at this, I saw this as a link on Facebook, as you're scrolling down the page, reading what all people your friends have come up with, and then you get that sort of news bar that comes across, and it was on there. And I clicked on it because I was a little bit cynical, to be honest, because of all the plans that I've seen from people acting under the auspices of Black Lives Matter, I haven't found them, to be frank, to be very worthy in the main. And they've generally revolved around university campuses or demands made most recently. And I think it was a gay pride march where the black and ethnic minorities community, which was made the guests of honour, decided to just sit down in the road, disrupt the march and make a list of demands and say that we will not move and allow your march to continue until you give in to our blackmailings. And the demands that are made in these things, of course, they've been quite famously made at a couple of universities, are typically very asymmetrical. They sound like the kind of demands that kidnappers make, other than without the helicopter and the bag of goodies to take away within a can of Coke. Other than those, they almost have that kind of edge to them, and they're very asymmetrical in nature, and it's almost like a kind of special pleading. We want these things that are just going to apply to us, and we need to be made a special case. And so when I went to view this 10-point plan, I was expecting more of the same. But where are those other lists of demands that I've seen have come across of something that could be written by a whinging, whining 14-year-old child? This has a rather more adult and mature theme to it. And rather than being a list of demands, it's a list of campaign points to aim towards. And it actually amounts to something that, and this is the way legislation should work, and this is the way that social change should work, I propose, which is, although you may be doing it minded of a particular group, and obviously this is Black Lives Matter, so they're doing it minded of black people in the United States and their experiences with the police, it's something that is to the betterment and therefore the sake of all people, right? It's something that applies equally across the board. It doesn't say this is how you treat black people, or you have to treat black people in this special way. What it says is this is a set of basic standards which would improve things for everybody. Now that may impact more on black people than everybody else because it needs to, because they're overall experiencing worse police treatment than everybody else, but it's a set of standards for everybody. So that makes it a lot more adult, a lot more mature, and a lot more a way things are actually done in the real world. So I was really rather surprised when I went through this list. Now I'm going to give some comments on some of these, some of them because I live in the United Kingdom. I don't know how things work in the United States. I won't have too much to say. Some of them I just want to give the UK perspective because we have a perspective on this. So let's get started on the list. and I'll tell you what I find about this list that's so good and a few concerns that I have. Okay, so the first one, ending broken windows policing, which aggressively polices minor crimes in an attempt to stop larger ones. Okay, mixed feelings about this. Let me explain this one. If you have a look at the Campaign Zero site, it's quite clear what their perspective is, which is that these things are sometimes used as a bit of a smokescreen. It's not the fact that the policy exists, but it's the way that it's applied, and that it can be applied as a kind of justification for treating one group differently to another, and in this instance discriminating against black people. There's a more heavy-handed, aggressive approach to treating black people when they've done these particular things that come under this than other groups. Okay, now I get that, and that might well be the case. But something just to bear in mind, because we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Something that I know, having been spoken to, listened to talks from police officers, is there's this curious phenomena, which is if you take an area of social deprivation and you bring that area up and make it look nice, that actually people's behaviour changes. People are less likely to vandalise the area and also less likely to commit violent crime. Curious fact, but it's true. And if then things, the way that it's been implemented in the UK is generally to clamp down on things. If a window is broken, you pay and get it repaired. If a wall is graffitied or tagged, you get it scrubbed off straight away. Okay, things are clamped down on straight away to keep things looking nice, because as long as things are kept looking nice, those acts become sporadic, and actually greater acts then, acts of violence and stuff, don't tend to take place to the same degree if the area looks nice. If you allow those things, if you allow that broken window to stay broken, what happens is then more windows get broken and things get tagged, and gradually there's a kind of exponential increase in these kinds of things and an escalation to greater and greater acts. That is a phenomena that is known about within policing, and you wouldn't want to stop the ability to do that. So I think we need to be a little bit clear on a couple of things here. One is, like I say, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to not adopt some set of procedures that stops you clamping down on these things when we know there is benefit both to society and the people in these particular communities in doing so. But at the same stage, what they're talking about is aggressively policing minor crimes. I think you can police these minor crimes and get on top of them, but what is important is that, obviously, that you treat everybody. It doesn't matter whether you're black and white. If you've broken a window, it's treated the same. If you're loitering or committing another act of vandalism or whatever it is, that you're treated the same, of course. But also that the way that you treat people is still in keeping with the crime. It's still in perspective with the crime, right? And it's not out of all proportion. I think that's very, very important. You may, as a police force, see a link between these smaller acts and an escalation to larger acts, but you still can't treat these smaller acts as if they are larger acts. You've still got to treat them on the level in which they've been committed. And I think that's very important. Now, one last thing on this particular point, on the Campaign Zero site, they don't mention it in the headline point, but under the list, it also calls for an end to something which is, I know, very controversial, which is this business of profiling. And it's a really interesting thing. I mean, you can make a whole video just on profiling, really, because I think most people, there are certain things which, when they're profiled, we kind of move away from. You know, if people are people are profiled in regards to religion, for example, or race, we kind of see that as perhaps a little bit dodgy. But at the same stage, two things that they include on this Campaign Zero site are age and gender. Well, if you don't profile at all, if you take no account of that, then that means that the police would regard a fit, healthy, strong, virile 18-year-old man as no different from an 80-year-old grandmother. Yet clearly both their predisposition towards carrying out crime statistically, but also their ability to carry out violent crime is very different from one another. It's going to be a very, very inefficient police service you're running if the police service are policing 80-year-old grandmothers in exactly the same way that they're policing 18-year-old men. Right? So we need to be a little bit careful with regard to the way that we allow the police to profile and the way the police do profile, but to stop them profiling in any way, shape or form, I think is maybe a little bit of a bridge too far. So it's a very complicated issue, that more complicated than we can fully deal with in this video. I now want to look at points 2 and 4 together. Point 2 is using community oversight for misconduct rather than having police decide what consequences officers face. And point 4 was independently investigating and prosecuting police misconduct. These are ones where I don't live in the United States, so I don't know what the experience is, but it seems from what I read that the police basically make their own investigations and they are judge, jury and executioner if you have a complaint to make against what amounts to a fellow officer. Now, we used to have a system like that in the UK, and then we brought in the IPCC, the Independent Police Complaints Commission, a couple of decades, I think it was, ago. And they are led by commissioners who aren't ex-police officers either. They're not just independent as they are, but they are people that have never been police officers. But obviously they develop quite a strong understanding of how the police work, and so a sensitivity to the pressures that police are under, but nevertheless they are independent. Now, what happens is, if you make a complaint against the police may handle that complaint, but those complaints are overseen by the Independent Police Complaints Commission. Now, if the complaint is serious, and this is the important thing, so if somebody dies in custody, and that doesn't just mean in a police cell, like custody, it's regarded as in custody if the police are in the process of arresting you or chasing you down or whatever. If you die in custody, if a firearm is discharged, or if it's a misconduct investigation against a specific officer, then that is taken out of the police's hands. And in fact, the IPCC themselves will deal with it. They will be the ones that investigate that. So you are getting that independence, and that has two benefits. One, you are hopefully getting a much more independent outcome, which is a good thing. But the other thing is, from the public-facing side of it, if you bring a complaint against an officer, a very serious complaint, perhaps your brother's been killed in police custody or whatever, if it is found that the police acted reasonably, right, if the police have conducted that review, even if it was conducted properly and entirely above board by an officer who would never in a million years want to give any favours to his or her colleagues, you're still going to have your suspicions, aren't you? That the fact that it's a negative outcome means that it's a fucking cover-up. And that is why the independent nature is so important, because it at least gives you some idea that, well, okay, even if this is counted against me, hopefully it was still done in good faith and it was still done thoroughly and properly and from a neutral perspective. So I think it's to the benefit of everybody to have that kind of thing. And I'm kind of surprised that they don't have that system in the United States already. Now, the one we've gone past, making standards for reporting police use of deadly force, absolutely, I'm surprised that you don't have that. It's such an important thing. I'm surprised that that's not documented. And maybe if you had something akin to the IPCC, that would be one of the first things that they would do. Say, these are the things that we're going to actually be investigating, so we need this to be documented in this set way, which gives us the kind of information that we would need if an investigation is to be carried out in these circumstances. Next one's a very interesting one. Number 5, having the racial makeup of police departments reflect the communities they serve. What a big one that is. I can understand why people would push towards that, but I think we need to be a little bit careful on that. First, let me say that I've tried to empathise with regard to that. And I live in a part of the United Kingdom that is overwhelmingly white, right? So it's hard for me to empathise in that situation. But I've imagined myself going to Kenya, let's say. And let's say a group of half a dozen officers come up to me in Kenya and start accusing me of having done something or criticising me or saying they're going to arrest me. They may well all be black officers. And I may have a suspicion that as a foreigner they're treating me differently, but I may have a suspicion that part of it is because I'm a white guy, that really, you know, that might be an aspect in why they're... If I feel that I haven't done anything wrong, I'm going to be wondering, why are they acting as if I am? And that is going to be one of the things that I suspect. And I think everybody would feel like that, surely. That is going to be something you suspect. You might be wrong, but you're going to suspect it. However, if one of those officers was a white Kenyan police officer, that would very much lower my index of suspicion, wouldn't it? Because I'd be thinking, well, is that white Kenyan police officer really going to go round with his colleagues looking to victimise or pick on or discriminate against white people? Probably not, because they're going to take umbrage against that, even if one of their colleagues isn't big enough to do the same. So I can understand the benefits in having that kind of diversity within a police force. Absolutely I can. But that is a different thing to suggesting that the racial makeup of a police department has to reflect the community they serve. And it's actually a very difficult thing to achieve, especially if the racial diversity of your community isn't split equally along socio-economic lines and along the kind of lines that police forces are traditionally drawn from. This is something that we found in some circumstances around the United Kingdom with regard to fire services, which is that they tend to pull from certain communities and not from others, and that there's certain communities that hold being a firefighter in very high regard and others that don't, that would rather see their children or see themselves going into other areas. And so to get that kind of diversity is something of a challenge to overcome there. And it's the same thing I would think with the police, for slightly different things, which is that with the police, often the lowest socio-economic groups don't hold the police in particularly high regard. And I know this in the UK. I'm not talking about black areas in the UK, I'm talking about white, lower socio-economic areas. They hold the police in very, very low regard, and the police don't tend to draw recruits so readily from those areas, because after all, if you join the police in that area, some of your friends aren't going to hold that in very high regard. They might not want to speak to you again, right? You might actually get a hard time from the people you live with. So that provides a recruiting imbalance that's hard to overcome. Now, if one demographic, racial demographic, tends to be in those lower socioeconomic groups, it's going to be very difficult. You're going to have a very low expectation that you can reflect the community in exactly the proportions that it exists, right? And you'd probably have to be discriminatory in the kind of way that you wouldn't want to be in terms of applicants to actually achieve that aim. And the point that I'm making is, do you really need to achieve that aim? If 50% or 60% of a particular community that's being policed is black, do you really need 60% of that officers to be black? Probably not. But what you do need is some visible, conspicuous representation so that people don't feel that they are being victimized, or at least it takes that racial element out of the equation as much as you can. So I think that I understand why that would be a kind of something to aim for in some ways, but I think if you set that as too hard a target, you're setting an unreasonable expectation, and you're going to start skewing aspects of policing and recruitment in ways, unforeseen ways perhaps, in ways that you wouldn't want to do so. Okay, the next one, require officers to wear body cameras. Well, and the next one, providing more training for police officers. They both trigger into a same thing, actually, in some ways. I don't know what the situation is in America, but it's anything like any public service in the United Kingdom: budget and time constraints, because everything costs. Training costs in terms of officers are not doing their job, they're being trained. And it costs money to train officers. To give every officer a body camera costs money. All of that is going to come out of police budgets. And it's all right demanding these things, but usually when these things are demanded, no extra budget is made available for these things. That means less police officers, or it means something being lost somewhere else, right? And that is something that police forces and all public sector departments have to battle against all the time whenever these extra demands are made. Now, in terms of wearing body cameras, there's some real benefit to that, and they wouldn't be the only. I mean, that's something that the police do in lots of different countries, and so do other emergency services and public bodies. And part of that, there is a real benefit there, because not only does that hold the officer account to their behaviour, and you have a record of the way that an officer is interacting with somebody, which is what this particular group are minded of, but there's also some benefit to the officer, both in terms of It also has a record of the person that they're interacting with and how aggressively they're acting towards the officer, and can justify the officer's act of aggression in protecting themselves, etc., etc. But also it can act as a major dissuader. Right, so what it can do is, by having that kind of thing, you know, if you want to act aggressively against a police officer, if you know that you're being surveilled, right, then you know that there is a record of that. And you can't really argue against what you've said and what you've done, because it's there. It's being recorded, what you've said and what you've done. And there's nothing that you can say that's going to naysay what's being shown there. So there is some benefit for the officer as well. So I don't think that that's a bad thing, as long as the budget's there to provide for it. Okay, end of for-profit policing practices. I tried to read a bit about how this takes place in the United States. It does take place in the United Kingdom, and I know that it puts people's backs up, certainly with regard to speed cameras. One of the things that we've had with regard to that is the suggestion, and I'm not saying this always happens, but the suggestion that it skews the locations, for example, of where the police might put a speed camera. Because if you've got one site where maybe that would be your optimal site, it might not catch that many people, but it's a very dangerous site, and it's a site where if people are speeding there, there's a high danger that it could lead to an injury or a death. And then you've got another site where it's a much clearer section of road, maybe the view's a lot better, a lot less dangerous bit of road. Statistically, we know that, but there's a lot more cars and a lot more speeding, and you get a lot more people, and that's a lot more fines, and that's a lot more money in the coffers if the police can keep it. Now, you'd still want the police to do a good thing, wouldn't you, and put the speed camera where the real danger is, but it's providing a terrible pull. It's providing a terrible pull there. And I can see some of these laws in the States, this civil forfeiture of where the police can take your property, and then it's up to you to prove that you got that through legitimate means, otherwise you can't get it back. And if you haven't got the resources to prove that, you end up doing a deal with the police and you get a portion of it back because you don't have the wherewithal to actually drive that through and get it all back. That's a horrible position. And again, what a temptation for a police force to act in a way which is against the interests of the people that are being policed. It's a mega temptation for a police force there to act in ways that they really shouldn't be acting. Ending the police use of military equipment. I tell you what, just let me leave that one and go into the last one, implementing police union contracts, to say that I don't really know a lot about that. And I hope that anything that you think would be covered in that, I've detailed in how I think that things commended some of the earlier ones. So just to get that one out of the way, and then end on the police use of military equipment. I think this is a real double-edged sword, and I've kind of concerns about this both ways. Something that happened in Iraq with the area that the British Army were policing. I'm using the policing for the military and military for the police, but the area that they were dealing with is that they made a decision that rather than what the Americans were doing in the areas that they were dealing with, that they would take their helmets off and put their berets on. There's a risk associated to that, and the risk is that you could get shot in the head, of course. But there's also, it's a cost-benefit analysis that they'd made. And the benefit was that they wouldn't look as antagonistic, they wouldn't look as aggressive, and maybe on behalf of that, the population would regard them as working with them for their benefit and would be on their side, rather than it looking like a military imposition. And for all the local people to feel that they were all being subdued by these people going around in full military armour. Armour's the weapon. It's not a complicated word, is it? But I didn't seem to be able to find it. So that is the trade-off that you have to make. But the important point is the British Army were able to make that decision. Nobody was taking their helmets away from them. Nobody was taking their armour away. They still had it as an option. And this is the thing when it says ending the police use of military equipment. I don't know what the mantra is for US police. For British firefighters, it's self, team, casualty. And what that means is that ultimately your total priority, your main overriding priority is to keep yourself alive. That is your biggest priority. Then it is to keep your team alive. And then it is to save the life of the casualty. And there's several reasons for that. One is that if the team goes down, you're not going to save the casualty anyway. But ultimately, you should be going home, in my case, to my wife and my baby boy. That doesn't mean that I won't take risks to save a life. And the same thing is true of police officers, of course. It doesn't mean that police officers won't take a risk to save a life or to save somebody else who's going to be in danger, or to stop a situation escalating or what have you. But at the end of the day, police officers are human beings, and they shouldn't be expected to put themselves in more danger than they reasonably need to be in to deal with a scenario. And when you've got people with guns, when you've got people that hate police officers and want to kill police officers, as some people do, that hold police officers as the lowest of the low, I wouldn't want to be the one who denied them an option, right? Even if it's a fairly heavy duty option, if it's affording them protection, then it's got to be right that if the circumstances dictate, and if they have the money, if they have that option, that option is made available to them and not withdrawn from them and said, well, that's just tough. You are going to have to place yourself in danger. And there might be a chance as a result of that decision that a wife or a husband and some children at home aren't going to see mummy or daddy coming home. That cannot be right, that. Of course, then the emphasis is on the police force to make the right decision. And I think this is really what's the key issue here, is when is the right time to employ these very heavy-handed things, and when is not the right time? When is it just antagonizing unnecessarily? When is it being seen as insensitive? When is it being seen as challenging and confrontational to escalate the equipment the police use and the tactics the police use? And when is it really just making the police safer and making other elements of the community safer? I was kind of shocked, I must admit. The police had used this robot to blow up somebody who'd already killed 5 police officers. I was kind of shocked that there were people challenging the fact that they'd used a robot. I don't know what the suggestion is. That what is it, because that doesn't include an act of bravery, that a police officer should have run down the street half naked and shot the person and took, because unless you're putting a police officer at risk, right, that it's not sporting or something, I don't know. If you have a lone gunman who shot 5 police officers, if it's not acceptable under those circumstances to use a robot to stop putting a police officer in danger, when you can use that robot without endangering anybody else, of course, if that robot was acting in an autonomous way, sort of like the RoboCop film that could end up endangering other people, that's a different matter, of course. But if you begrudge the police that, then I think what you're saying is that you have an expectation that the police can only use tactics that are going to put them in danger, and I think that's a little bit unfair on the police force. I think this is actually a really good list of 10 things, way more adult than any of the other things that I've seen Black Lives Matter groups come up with. And like I say, I don't think this is something that's just to the benefit, that would be just to the benefit of black people. Maybe they would benefit from it more than everybody else, and that's absolutely fantastic, because maybe them, along with perhaps the Hispanic groups in the States, need that a little bit more, because they get a little bit more unwarranted heavy-handed policing along the way. But this just seems to me, generally with a few caveats, a pretty endorsable list of things. I'm interested to know what anybody else thinks as a result of that. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.